Well, good morning, everyone. We'll pick up this week. We got into the purpose of Esther last week, and this is right where we're supposed to be. Historical. We're going to look at the historical section. And our first thought we were going to look at today is how does the story of Esther illustrate the importance of taking a firm stand for truth and righteousness regardless of the consequences that may follow. If you scanned through your book of Esther, and refresh your memory with the story of that, King Ahasuerus, had I guess we could call it an open house on his kingdom, his throne, his castle, his palace. I guess wouldn't be castle, it'd be a palace. But he had a kind of an open house, and he displayed all his riches and his wealth. And he did that in verse 4, tells us, for 180 days. We're not told why he did it in the book of Esther. Secular history says he was preparing for a battle with the Greeks. Whether he was or not, we don't know. But he decided to display his wealth anyway. And we see nearing the end of that display, he gets all his the princes together, and they're all drinking. He offers his wine, the best wine of the kingdom. He puts no limits on how much anyone could drink. If they wanted to drink to the point of drunkenness, they were allowed. And then we see that he asked his wife to come and parade herself in front of the princess, showing her beauty, and she refuses. She refuses, and he counsels with his princes, his advisors, and they suggest to him to get rid of her as queen, to divorce her, if you will, send her away. And that is kind of the beginning of the story. And then later on, Ahasuerus realizes his mistake. He's sorry about what he did to his queen, to his wife, but it's too late now. He's made a decree. And so he can't really go back on that decree now. And that's where Esther comes into the picture. But without maybe relying on relaying the whole story again to you, just to get you thinking, what in this story do you see then? How do you see the importance of taking a stand for truth? Or who do you see that takes a stand? I'll give you a little Titus verse 3 and 1 was a verse that I came up with. Titus 3 and verse 1 says, remind them to be subject to rulers, to authorities, to be obedient, to be, and this is what I want us to remember, to be ready for every good deed. Be always ready. That's what I want us to think about. Keep that in the back of your mind as you think about the story of Esther. And who in there do you think took a firm stand? If you think about who did, then maybe you see the importance of it. And you think of...
It's righteousness and godliness. The Jews were, especially Esther and Mordecai, they believe and they obeyed God for what it is worth. So it's godly living, and they practiced it. So the righteous has no fear in obeying and doing. And she had said, if I perish, I perish. So when you stand for godliness, you don't care because God is in control.
Okay, right. Carla, right. Well, you mentioned Mordecai a first, we look at Mordecai and we see his unwavering dedication to God, don't we, through this story, and his prayerful spirituality we see. Remember, he in the beginning showed his godly nature, I think, by bringing up Esther, his orphan cousin. He took her into his home and looked after her, raised her. He counseled her. Every time you read of him counseling her, it is with godly counsel. Just the fact that he took her in and looked after her is impressive. Sometimes when we're imposed upon to make that much of a sacrifice, it's a little touchy. But Mordecai, made that sacrifice. That's what I see. Jeff?
Notice in Mordecai's attitude in verse 14 of chapter 4, he trusts and believes. He knows God's promises for the Jews. He knows that if Esther's not willing to do something she can do to help, his deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. He is firm in understanding that God will fulfill what he has said he will. A lot of trust in his part for his character.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, he would have known of the line of the Jews, God's covenant with them, so he understood all that. We see there, now that you mention him again, that his guidance wasn't wasted at all on Esther, because he influenced her. And then, as touching on what Carla said, her common life, I was thinking, she's now a queen. Her common life is behind her. Her orphanage, whatever struggle she had, is gone. She's sharing the throne of Persia, with King Ahasuerus. That's that could be the beginning of her ruin, because money has been and will always be the ruin of many righteous people, but not Esther. And we see there, actually Jeff mentioned the verse 14. You read there, I think it's that passage where Esther said, if I perish, I perish. Was it that?
Verse 16.
17?
16.
Oh, or 15. Oh, yes.
16.
16. Okay, sorry. Go assemble all the Jews. This is Mordecai here. Or Esther sends the reply back to Mordecai. And she says, go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa and fast for me. Okay, there's nothing wrong with her. She's seeking prayers there in strength. And do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way. And thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. That's... don't get me wrong here. I won't say for a woman. That's a pretty amazing for Esther. That's how I look at it. Because she's come from nothing. And now she has everything. She has more than we'll ever have in this life. And yet she says this, if I perish, I perish. I'll take a stand. That's pretty impressive, Colin.
Yeah, it was like Moses too. Similarly, he grew up in Pharaoh's house. He had all the riches, all whatever that he could get. But when you God-fearing, all these things doesn't matter. You have it, but you love the Lord with all your heart and mind. God was foremost in your lives, and all the other things didn't matter. And that is real God-fearing. People they didn't care what they have, what they will lose, and that's really, really trusting in the Lord to for guidance and obeying God.
Right, right. Well, both of them display the trust in God. To them didn't matter what they had at the moment. They were leaving things in God's hand, but they were doing though also what God would expect them to do. I think we can't just sit back and do nothing. You know what I mean? They showed their courage, and I think they were blessed because of what they did. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts. I thought first of Queen Vashti, because I thought sometimes I've had this experience, and it's embarrassing. Sometimes those of the world give us reason to meditate upon our righteousness, to meditate upon maybe how we've acted as compared to how we should have acted. Sometimes it's the world that gives us that jolt, that embarrasses us. And I see that with Queen Vashti. She chose to risk. We're told in chapter 1 that she was at her party with all the ladies. And that was the custom of that time. The men didn't, you didn't socialize together. The women socialized separately from the men. That was, I'm not saying that was God's law, but that was the law of the Gentiles. That's how they participated at that time. And she was doing exactly what she should have been doing. But then when her husband asked her to parade herself in front of all these drunken princes and those in authority, she risked everything she had. She risked her power, her luxury, and possibly her life because of her upright morals. She chose not to do that. And we're really not told, I think, good for her. That's an example. We're not really told anything about her afterwards, except that she was banished from her throne. But it's interesting that we do know that later King Ahasuerus realized it bothered his conscience. He missed her. He realized, he regretted his foolishness, I think. But see, now it was too late. The damage was done, But I just think of her. She showed some courage there, some godly morals. And obviously she wasn't a Jew. She was a Gentile. But yet she at least stood by the morals that they had been brought up under and taught. So that's pretty good for that. No other thoughts? Well, we'll move along then to our doctrinal section. And Dave asks us, sorry, no. Did I miss a question there? Maybe not. No.
I think you were behind.
Oh, was I?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, I didn't have doctrinal.
That was the doctrinal.
Right, okay. That was the doctrinal section. Sorry, guys. Jesus Christ, we'll look at, as we have with every book, looked at, finding Jesus and prophecies of him within there. And Dave asks us, what connection is there between the promises that God made to Abraham in Genesis 12? Remember, and Dave puts them all down there, the promise to Abraham, and then to Isaac, to Jacob, and speaking of the descendant coming from the tribe of Judah, down through the line of David. But knowing those, and we've studied all those prophecies, and now we come to a guy, Haman. Haman, as we see somewhere in our story, just after Esther was put in the position of being queen. For some reason, when we're not told, but King Ahasuerus elevates Haman to a position really of such as a right-hand man. And Haman is the one that comes up with the plan to destroy all the Jews. Can you remember why did he come up with that plan? Did anyone remember? That's an important point too.
He was not bound down to the king.
Yep.
Mordecai was not bound down to the king.
Yep.
Refused to, I suppose, from what I can remember.
Where he wasn't bound down to Haman.
To,
To
was it
Haman.
Haman? Or
Yeah, it was Haman. Haman's great position went to his head. Figured everybody should bow to him, and Mordecai wouldn't do that. And so, of course, in fury, I think we might touch on that. And I was trying not to overlap all thoughts. I think that comes up later. I'm pretty sure it does. I just can't see it here now. But we talk about that. But that's what he did. Anyways, and Mordecai wouldn't bow down to him. So Haman goes to the king, and has a law passed to destroy all the Jews. And so that's the idea here. Actually, I don't know whether to read all that. I guess it is only a few verses. I'll read that for us then. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." That's speaking of the Jews now, okay? And then Haman says, "Their laws are different from those of all other people, and they do not observe the king's laws, so it is not in the king's interest to let them remain." Total lie, isn't it, what Haman's saying here, to an extent. But then he says, "If it's pleasing to the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who carry on the king's business to put into the king's treasury." There's a bribe from Haman. Then the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. The king said to Haman, "The silver is yours, and the people also, to do with them as you please." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and it was written, just as Haman commanded, to the king's satraps, to the governors who were over each province, and to the princesses of each people, each province according to its script, each people according to its language, being written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. In other words, Haman's making sure everyone knows about this petition, no matter what language you speak, no matter where you live in the kingdom. And then letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all the Jews, both young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to seize their possessions as plunder. He wasn't making any mistakes, was he, Haman? Making a group plan here. One day, we're all ready. We're going to destroy them. And a copy of the edict to be issued as law in every province was published to all the peoples so that they should be ready for this day. So having read that, what connection? Thinking of what Haman's plan was, and thinking of the promises that God made to Abraham, how do we see a connection in there? Can you see a...
Well, I guess God had promised that he would make of Abraham a great nation. He said, "I will bless them that bless you and curse them that curse you." God had promised to Abraham that the people would exist as far as that they would not be taken out. He promised, okay, if nations bless you, I will bless them. But if nations curse you, I will curse them. And so it was a promise of protection in one sense.
Right.
Even as God punished them, it was still a promise of protection that Abraham's seed would not cease to exist during that purpose. Anyway, I think that's where Dave's going.
Well, that's what I thought. You're right. I thought the connection I see in there is God. Because, like God made the promise to Abraham. Okay, and here now we have Haman going to try and destroy all the Jews, making a plan. Well, had they all been destroyed, then what would have happened? Where would Jesus had come from? How would the Jewish line have continued? If they'd all been wiped out in that day.
Yeah, we forget this wasn't just in Shushan and the Medes and the Persians. This was all the way back to where we're dealing with Ezra and Nehemiah and those Jews too.
Right.
Like as far as it's not just in that city or in that region. It was everywhere.
Yeah.
And it was almost, you could compare it to the Holocaust in one sense in the 20th century. That was the idea. You collect all the Jews, you kill them.
Right.
And that was his plan.
Right. That's what I thought of it. The seriousness of this was after I read that, I realized they were covering the whole kingdom of Persia, wherever Jews lived in that kingdom. This was organized, and I thought of our 20th century, we call them like genocides now. A lot of times there's millions of people wiped out. And had this happened, then that would have been the end of the line of the Jews. And we see then through Mordecai, which when you think about it is pretty amazing, through Mordecai and Esther, and God also used, who else did God use in this plan here, or in this scenario?
To save the Jews? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, to save the Jews. There was one...
Ahasuerus.
Right, he used the king, right? Because Esther went, and Mordecai went, and if you read the story, I think the reason the king appreciated Mordecai so much, I think he had a good position in government, but Mordecai had discovered a plan of a couple of nobles that were going to rebel against the king. And Mordecai made that known. And those rebels were killed. So, and that record was kept, and the king found out, was reminded about that again, that what Mordecai had done. So he respected Mordecai. And then Mordecai and Esther were the ones that said, okay, the king allowed them then on that day that they were to be annihilated, they could fight back against their enemies, and they could destroy their enemies. That way his first law of having the Jews annihilated, he couldn't break that, could he? Because he had already petitioned that. He couldn't take that back. So he granted them the privilege of fighting against their enemies. And we see that they did, and they won.
And the thing is, Haman couldn't stop it because it was a law that couldn't be changed. It was
right.
It was a peculiarity of this people that, and we'll see it when we get to Daniel. I don't know if it's in this book or later on. When we get to Daniel, it's the same thing. That's what got Daniel into the lion's den. It's the same thing. And it's a strange law, and even the king couldn't break it. We think, the king could do it. No, not even the king.
Right.
Could break it.
Right.
Imagine if we had that today.
Well,
that would be bad.
We might be in big trouble then, eh? But you're right. That's why the king couldn't have Vashti put back into her position of being queen, because once he made a law, a decree, it couldn't be changed. There was no way to change it.
But Vashti was not a Jew.
No.
So it could not have. That had to play out, and she has to go.
Well,
and where Esther has to come in, because she's a descendant of Abraham, and through Christ, that will be Christ will be born. And her name, according to David said, is a star, and Jesus is a bright and morning star.
Right.
So in Revelation 16, so and in Matthew 1, I mean that's how Jesus came into the picture, according to Jesus being the forerunner in the whole Bible.
Right, right. Yeah, Dave makes that comparison. I don't know whether it's exactly, it's hard to say, but her name was Star, and he is spoken of as the morning star. But, you know, the point is, though, that God used her, and you're right, Vashti, that was her role. And we don't know what happened to her after that. I had the thought this morning, I was thinking about that. I'm not so sure she would have been back to rags and dust way of living, because remember, first of all, to become queen, you had to come from royalty. You had to come from a well-to-do Persian family to even apply, if you will, for that position. That's why it's so amazing with Esther. We see God's hand, because Esther was a Jew, was an orphan, wasn't of any royal family in Persia. You know, she shouldn't even have been offered that position. But with Vashti, it's just a guess, but I'm sure she was probably well looked after that. You know, but the fact was, yes, that was God's plan to play it out that way. But the fact that King Ahasuerus had respect for Mordecai and then granted him that law to go ahead and kill his enemies was, I see God's hand there too. Because the king could have very well said, well, no, you suffer consequences of Haman's law. You can't fight back. You know. So we just see God's hand there. Jeremy?
Before I move on, it was it's interesting. I read some of the commentaries, not in Dave's commentary, but about Haman himself. And a couple of commentaries believe that this man was the descendant of the king that Saul saved. And
Yes.
I don't know if that's true or not, because it's an Agagite, and there's King Agag that Saul saved. I don't know if that's exactly true, but if it is, imagine the consequences for one sin, that because he was supposed to destroy that king. There was not supposed to be any living people after that.
Right.
And Haman, and if it's true, lo and behold, here's Haman. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, from that lineage. That's just interesting to consider. I don't know if it's exactly true, but some of the commentators seem to think it is.
Right.
I don't know where they get it, but other than the name.
That's right. Yeah, I read that. Also, I just forget I read about, was it your dad had a lesson Wednesday night on that character, Shimei or
Shimei.
Shimei.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I had read something about him in all this lineage.
I haven't caught that, but
Yeah, but I'm not sure. But it is interesting to see how. And you mentioned earlier where God's saying that He would curse those who curse His people. Well, I see that in this scene here, because He turned the pages on the battle, and the Jews destroyed those that were going to destroy them, which I found interesting in how God works. Jeff?
Good to notice here, it's interesting to see how faith works when we don't know everything.
Oh, right.
Because I'll go back to that same verse in chapter 4, verse 14. There's some things Mordecai didn't know, and there's some things he did know. It reminds me of Abraham with Isaac. Isaac was the promised son, and the promise was to go through his son Isaac. Abraham knew that. When God asked him to put Isaac to death, the Hebrews tells us that Abraham trusted that God would raise him up again.
Right.
Because he knew the promise came through. So he didn't understand everything, but he knew enough. And Mordecai here, he's saying, if you're silent at this time, Esther, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place.
Yep.
As that trusting God, he knows what God has said.
Right.
So if however's going to happen, if she doesn't do it, it's going to happen, because you can't destroy God's word. But he does say later in that same verse, he says, yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this.
Right.
In other words, it's possible. We need to be able to say that it's possible that this situation has come in your life to accomplish what God wants on here. We don't know for sure because God hasn't said it, so I can't say by faith that God has expressly said it. But it's possible that you can do what God wants you to do in this situation.
Right.
So it's interesting how we can handle things that we don't know. Because I know a lot of people want to look at the world and say, well, this happened because God made it happen.
Yes.
How
Yeah.
do we know that?
Well, I
Don't
know.
that. But what we do know is, like Mordecai, we know the things that God has promised, and we know the things that we're able to do to follow God's word. That's
Right.
enough.
Right.
I'm shaking my head because Jeff's stealing my sermon.
Oh,
not,
is
from
he?
not from today, but he's
That's
stealing
right.
it.
That's good. That's a good point. More interesting is how he ends that verse, and who knows. That's a good point. And a lot of times we need to be careful. It's my opinion when we speak of God's providence in the day and age that we live in.
Don't steal too much of today's sermon either.
Oh, okay, right. Okay, well, we'll leave that. We won't steal any of Jeremy's sermon. But that's the point. Mordecai, who knows? See, but Mordecai's faith was God's going to look after it. Who knows how? But if I suffer, and Esther too, if I suffer, if I perish, so be it. But God's plan's going to come about. If it involves me, then, that's probably the way to say it. If it involves me suffering, then so be it. That's a lot of courage, But Jeremy?
I was just saying, Peter said, if any man suffers a Christian, let rejoice. That
Yes.
seems very strange to say, but we're to rejoice. I'm going to leave it at that because
Yeah,
we're running low on time.
Right. Well, and I don't want to steal. Once I know it's grabbing out of your sermon, we don't want to steal any thoughts. But next we look at the content of Esther. And the Jews in exile is the first thing we want to look at. Remember in our study of Ezra, let's not forget now, because we're back in Persia here in Esther, and there's no mention God's name. There's no mention of the Jews outside of Persia. But remember the two distinct returns from Babylonian captivity. Remember Zerubbabel with 42,000 Jews, 7,000 roughly servants. And then remember Ezra went back 80 years after that with his 2,000. And then in Nehemiah, we read of Nehemiah's return. Well, now, these were the Jews that tried to do it right, we might say. Those are my words. They were the ones that God had stirred up. Remember in Ezra 1 and verse 5, we read there that God stirred up some of the Jews. That remnant is now back in Jerusalem. Those are the ones that their hearts were stirred to be back into their homeland. And they gathered with great unity. Remember we read that in Ezra 3 and 1, and we talked about that point. They gathered as one man. So they were unified as one man to rebuild the altar of sacrifice and correctly offer sacrifices according to their law. And they were the ones that laid the foundation of the temple, followed by the structure. And then of course, the wall around the city. And then within that period, these are those Jews that were left in Persia, in Susa, I guess is how you pronounce that. Now, one thing I read that I had forgot about, that these Jews that were left in Shushan or Susa, though they had in fact generously helped those that went back to Jerusalem in their venture. Remember, we read that in Ezra 1, I think it was. Ezra 1 and verse 6. We read there, and all those about them, the them is the ones that are going back to Jerusalem. We read there then, they encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, and with goods, with cattle, with valuables, aside from all that was given as a free will offering. It's interesting that those Jews that didn't go back to Jerusalem, they chose to continue their lifestyle in Persia for information that we don't have. We're not told in the Bible. You have to turn to secular history if you want to read about that. But we can't make it biblical fact if it's not in the Bible. But we know they helped them, but we can safely, I think, surmise that they chose not to have now the close covenant relationship with God that they had before. I think I can, what others think, but I think we can safely say that. Why they stayed behind, we don't know. Did they forsake God completely? The safe way I find is saying it is they chose not to have a close covenant relationship with God. That might have been a bad move. Jeremy?
And yet God's providence, even through them. Esther, if Esther and Mordecai aren't there, Haman still may rise. Haman still may do what he did.
Yeah.
And God would have found another way. I'm not saying that, but
right.
Again, God's providence.
Right. Well, we were talk about that idea a little later, but yes, that's what we do see. God's still reaching out to them in His mercy, isn't He? Because He just protected them, saved them from annihilation. Okay, well, the bell's gone, so we'll end our class there then.